So according to this, we're on page 565. I'm going to go over the first part of the chapter, so about the first 10 or 12 pages. Much of it should be review. We're not going to go through this test scores application. We'll take a quick look at it, but we won't really, and maybe a little bit of time on it, but not really too much time. All right, then we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about closures some more. We'll talk about the module pattern and how to work with ES modules. All right, and that'll be it for what we're going to cover today. So, all right. I may have put some notes in my book. I don't remember if I did or not, so I'm going to hold that on my lap. All right. Again, you already saw this before, but I'm showing it to you again. This is page 567 in the book. And they show 3 different ways that you can create this alias. So you can set the $sign. We've done it for document.getElementById. Here they're doing it for document.querySelector. The point is this. All 3 of those work. All right? So with the first case, with the function declaration, you know this already. It starts with the word function. Give it a name. You have to put in parentheses that you can optionally put in parameters. Then inside of the curly braces, boom, there it is. All right? With the function expression, since expression means you are taking the function and you are assigning it to something. All right? So as it says there, const, and then it's the name, equal function, parameters. It works the same way, but again, as you can see, it has the semicolon on the end. All right? Finally, with the last case that's there, all right, that's an arrow function. And remember, I'm not going to write it again, but if you look at that example, it's about halfway down on page 567. That could have been rewritten all on one line. And if you did that, okay, if you did that, you, so there it is. That's the full syntax. You could have done it like this. All right? So again, this, to me, the stuff that's golden in these chapters is the stuff, the descriptions that are on the bottom of the page. All right? And as it says right here, a function is a block of code. Ideally, a function does one task. That's what I tried teaching you from day 1 in the AWD 1000 class. I even mentioned to you that if you are asking a user for 10 pieces of information, first name, middle initial, last name, address, city, state, zip, etc., in an ideal world, you would put that into 10 different functions. That way, if you had problems with any of them, you'd know right where to go. That's not how most people write code. That's just too much. But again, in an ideal world, if you have a program with 500 lines of code in it, much better to have 50 functions that are 10 lines long each than 10 functions that are 50 lines long each. I mentioned to you the virtue of writing a little code, testing it, writing a little code, testing it. And hopefully, at least most of you, that's what you're doing. I can't tell you the number of people I know who are developers who still don't do it that way. They'll write hundreds of lines of code. Oh, I better test this now. And if they put everything in one big chunky function and stuff doesn't work, then what do? They start commenting stuff out. But if you write a little bit and put that stuff into one function, have that call another function, have that call another function, etc., that way you're best off. And that's what they're talking about in here. So the declaration starts with the function keyword. The expression uses the function keyword, but it assigns it to a constant. And again, it must have the semicolon on the end, or it's expected usually. And the arrow function uses that arrow operator. And again, I do understand they wanted a different operator. I don't know if that was the best one, because I still have people who tell me that they get confused between that and a greater than equal sign. All right, next is default parameters. Again, I showed you these. All right. And notice when they say here, if you omit a parameter, it automatically gets the value undefined. And that's important because they're going to show you a couple of examples on the next page. One where they omit it, All right, so it's undefined. Another time when they pass it as null. When they pass it as null, it's nothing. That's a big difference between doing that and omitting it. So when you look at the example here at the top of the page, we've got a thing called calculate tax rate. All right, and you've got a subtotal, which you're going to always pass in. Then you've got a default tax rate of 7.4%. All right, but that doesn't mean it has to be that way. Now, so why is this even important? Let's pretend for a second that if everybody who shops Amazon, I don't know exactly how theirs works, but let's just pretend. Everybody who shops Amazon in the United States gets charged, let's say, 10% sales tax, no matter what you buy. But if you buy from out of the United States, it's different. Probably most of the transactions that take place, and maybe I'm wrong here, for Amazon are probably within the United States. So we could come in and default the tax rate here to like 0.1, 10%. Then if something came in from India and it was 15%, then we could do it like this, where we'd say 0.15. And if it was from another country, etc. So in the examples of the invocations, the 4 examples that you see here, the first one, it's automatically 100 is the subtotal, so it's going to use 7.4%, which gives you $7.40. In the next example, you pass 0.087 or 8.7%, so it's 870. In the third example, since it's null, it's 0. And I was trying to think, why would you do that? Remember how they had this right before school started, when they had the day when you had no sales tax? All right, or maybe it was the weekend, I don't know. All right, that'd be a time you could use that. And then again, undefined means use the default. All right. Again, you can default as many things in here as you want to or need to do. And they said this on the previous page, but this is where I saw that. I was not even aware of this. Unlike many other programming languages, JavaScript does not require you to code the default parameters at the end. However, it is still considered to be a good practice to do so. All right, I would, again, it's one of those things like JavaScript allows you to use single quotes or double quotes. Next semester in the Java class, single quotes will be used for a char variable, a character. So I always use double quotes whenever I can in JavaScript because that's the way it is in most programming languages. All right. Now this is a little different. It says how to use rest and spread. Yes, we talked about these before, but not in the confines that we're going to talk about them right now. Okay? So it says in chapter 15 you learn how to use the rest operator with arrays. Now you're going to use the rest operator in a function to define what's called a rest parameter. What this is going to allow you to do is to create what's called a variatic function. What the heck does that mean? Look on the screen, please. This assumes that you're passing in a tax rate. This means that your subtotal can be as many things in there as you wanted or needed to have. So notice this now works whether I pass in 1 thing, 2 things, 4 things, or 1,000 things. Not only that, I could have defaulted the tax rate. So we could have said tax rate equals 0.074 like they did before and then done this. But the idea with the ... in there, that's the variatic. All right, that's using the rest operator. All right. And what we're doing is we're telling it this can be of any size. That's exactly what it means. All right. So that's the rest part. Then when you look down towards the bottom, or I should say the middle of the page, it says when you code a rest parameter, you can only code 1, and it must be the last parameter. In other words, it collects the rest of the values. All right. Then it says there, I have the right page here, just saying. All right. Then it says here, underneath it, says since the array is prepared, in this case it uses the spread operator. Now, good, bad, or indifferent, when you use rest and when you use spread, they both use ... All right? But there are differences between them. So, as it says here on the bottom of the page, you use the rest operator to accept a variable number of parameters, all right, and put them into an array. All right, you use the spread operator, as it says there, to pass the elements in an array to a variatic function. All right, so it's are you coming or are you going type of an idea. All right, this is a good place to stop. We'll just cut it right here. And it is 104. Let's come back at 120. All right. All right, it's a little early, but if you look on the screen, I sent you guys this yesterday. I think I told you I take a lot of courses from udemy.com, and some of them are real good, some of them not so good. But if you go out to Udemy, they have a filter on there for price. So I filtered for JavaScript free, and I started looking through them. And these were a couple. They're by the same guy. I think I told you the other day, I don't think English is his first language, but he speaks it very well. And if you think there's something that you'd like that you're not getting out of this or whatever, all right, you might want to go take a look at that. All right. The other thing too is, and now I've got this here. I'm going to send this to you later, so don't worry about it. But this is the URL for it. It's from levelup.getconnected.com. 7 repos to help you master JavaScript. I started looking through these this morning. The first one is called JavaScript Algorithms and Data Structures. That's the stuff that gets discussed. The second one is Clean Code JavaScript. That's what gets discussed. Most of that you're pretty good with. This I've started looking at because I was looking for something that had Node best practices. And I started looking at it this morning, but I didn't get very far. But that's where I'm going to continue on with that. Now, this is pretty good. You don't know JS yet. And here's some of, basically they kind of talk about what happens under the hood. All right? But let's say that it's February and she's graduated, she's out, and she's at a job interview for a job as a JavaScript programmer, and she wants to brush up on stuff she may or may not remember. This one I thought was really good, this 33 JS concepts, because this is all the stuff that gets mentioned in there. Now, with that, for instance, if I chose promises, all right, so if I go in there and choose promises, they're going to have like a listing of articles on promises. And each one of those will be linked to us, etc. I just, like I said, I thought it was pretty good. I didn't look at the rest of them. There's 30 seconds of code. And remember this, when I had you do the Wes Bose stuff, he's also got a free JavaScript 30 course. And every day in there, he walks you through a different application. All right, if you think that's worth your while. Or not. All right, so jumping back into our book then, we left off how to work with the this keyword. All right. And it says, so far this book has shown you how to use the this keyword within the methods of a function or object. But you can use this all over the place. In fact, there will probably come a time in your JavaScript programming career, be it here or outside of here, that you mean to do something and you think, I'm referring to this correctly, why isn't it working? You might want to just put a this dot in front of it. And a lot of times that'll fix it. I've found that in the past. So as it says, I don't want to read this to you, but you've got the value of this in a regular function, all right? And again, down at the bottom of the page, they mention how arrow functions are a little bit different. They don't have their own this keyword. And what does that mean? That means that if you invoke something using the function word, function paren, and then you put your function, it's different than if you use the arrow function. So if you've got, your paren, and you've got the arrow symbol, that's not going to have as much versatility with the word this. All right. Now it says in legacy code, regular functions sometimes use the call, the apply, and the bind. I mentioned those to you earlier. All right. So this test scores application, I didn't want to really spend any time on it, except other than tell you, it's pretty good. I went through and looked at it. Now, what happens in here, I just want to kind of mention to you behind the scenes what happens. Let's imagine that, that we have a class and it's got 50 scores, and I put in all 50, okay? It's automatically going to keep up the average. And it's going to do that using, I think it's the spread operator. All right, we'll always just be adding every time you go in there. And then it's going to be able to use the min.max function, and you'll be able to use a variatic function, and you'll be able to pass it in all the scores, and it'll find you the high and the low. All right, so again, it's going to result in less lines of code than the old-fashioned type of way of doing it. Then, for whatever reason, they decided to show the last 3 scores. All right? So, I mean, is that big a thing? No, but look at the screen here, because what has to happen is if I come through here and I'm going to put in the next score and it's 100, 77 has to drop off, 100 has to come here, 96 moves over, and 94 moves over. All right? And like I said, the way they did this was pretty ingenious. So if we look quickly at the JavaScript here, notice get last. They're grabbing just, it says go through the array, but just basically what I have here is number equal 3. So it's going to just give me my last 3, and it's going to copy those. All right. I notice with the average, it was the reduce. They used the reduce method. So remember that tote is your counter, your accumulator. Val is the current score. So it's going to keep adding as long as you have them. So it'll keep doing that. Then when it gets done, it'll return this, which is that total divided by the length. All right. Now this isn't a variatic function, but it acts like one anyway, because it'll work no matter how many scores you have. Also, if you look at the top there, under the use strict, const is valid equals score. All right, and what are you doing? Score is the parameter, so it's the score you just passed in. After the arrow function is the code you want to run. So it says if you put in something non-numeric, or you put in something less than 1, or you put in something greater than 100, is valid is going to end up becoming, or is invalid rather, will be true. All right, there's a lot of ways you could have done this. You could have had an is valid variable, and you could have set it to true or false. But they're using an invalid. The only thing I would change on here is I would have said if score is less than 0 instead of score is less than 1. Somebody misses the test, you give them a 1, even though they weren't there. Not that like it's a big thing, but just so you see that. All right. Now, in here, this document ready, we haven't talked about that at all because that's jQuery, and we're not talking jQuery. But this is what they're telling to run in here. But that isn't what's important. The important thing in here is, notice the use of the this variable. All right. And in here, again, we've got, this is what's so cool about this, is we have variatic functions. So we're passing in the entire scores array, and we're telling it to give us math.max. All right. When math.max and math.min were originally created, they were for you to pass in 2 numbers and tell which one was bigger. So you didn't have to use an if statement. Now, with this variatic function, you can pass in an array of 1,000,000 numbers, and you can find your largest and smallest like that. And it's much less code. If you may or may not remember, but the way that we did it previously is we had we set like max. We set it equal to the first array element. Then we told it to go use a for loop and loop through the entire array. And if it found one that was greater than max that became the new max. But again, it was somewhere around maybe a half dozen or more lines of code. Now it's one line of code. All right. Now, when I show people later this semester, the first year people, we're going to do this program, I'm going to show it to them both ways. So they see both. You've already had it the old-fashioned way, and that's the way we're going to do it at first. Why? Because there's tons of legacy code out there that still does it like that. All right? Okay. It says the click event handler for the add score button is a regular function. So it's this keyword holds a reference to the add score button. Okay. All right. Oops, skip that. All right, then next they come into closures again. And again, I'm not saying that their explanation of closures rather is overly good, or I'm not saying that it's overly bad. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. The point is the example that they put on the next page, it does not differ that much from the example that we just saw when we went out to W3 schools. All right? At least the way it works is very similar. So on the bottom of the page here, on the bottom of page 579, as the author says in here, the scope chain refers to what is in scope. If something is in scope, you have access to it. If something is not in scope, you don't have access to it. You should already know things like this, but if let's say that I'm writing a real, let x equal 3. Let y equal 10. Let sum, that we won't even do it like that. Let's just say add 2, and we'll pass x, and we'll pass y. All right, and then we'll say sub 2, and again, we'll pass in x, and we'll pass in y. All right, now I'm going to just put ... here, meaning there's other code, and I don't care what it is. All right, but if I come down here, I'll use the old-fashioned, but we could use any of them. We can come in here and we can say const, etc. But let's just do it the old-fashioned way so you can really see this. Function add 2, and let's just call it n1 and n2. All right? And we're going to come in here and we're going to say sum equals n1 plus n2, and then console.log sum. All right, I'm going to copy this because the next one will be almost identical. So this will be called sub2 instead of add2. I said sub the first time, sorry. But that should say diff equals n1 minus n2 and diff. The bottom line is this, and I believe you all know this, and I really should have said let here. So let sum, and I should have said let diff here. But when they talk about scope chain, sum is only known inside of that routine, the add to routine. It comes to life once it's been declared. It dies once it hits the curly brace. Same thing with diff. All right. Now, had we done this, we could have come in here and said, let sum equal. And if we did that, all right, then we wouldn't have had to have done this. We could have, basically, let's just put it this way. If we would have left that off, it would be referring to that one that's in there. All right. And again, typically this is going to be in another routine. We should be shooting for always to have as few global variables as possible. All right. They do mention in here again, some of this you've already heard. This is the bottom of 581. All variables, constants, and functions in global scope are publicly available. All right. All properties and methods of a JavaScript object that's in global scope are publicly available. So this means critical objects can be overridden and deleted. Well, remember that if you pass an object from one routine to another, you pass the address. Once you pass the address, it's a reference. So any change you make is a permanent change. Again, you saw this a little earlier. You can create a closure by returning an inner function that refers to things in an outer function. All right. So, doesn't get any easier, doesn't get any better. But if you look on the bottom of page 583, an arrow function, again, does not have its own this keyword. All right. By contrast, a regular function does. Since an arrow function does not, as it says right here, the value of this is the value of the outer function, this keyword. So it's whatever that function is contained in. On the other hand, with a regular function, as it says, it's an inner function. All right. He says because it does have its own this, because of that, an inner function, regular function can't access the outer function's this keyword. All right, because they mean two different things. All right. And I mean, there's more to it than that. After a while, I don't know about you, but personally with me, it makes my head spin a little bit. All right. These are those slideshow things. I'm not going to go over those at all. All right. That jumps us all the way up to page 590, which, as you can see here, is how to work with a module pattern. All right. And patterns are an important thing. I mean, you're talking here about design patterns. You can buy entire books on different kinds of design patterns. Now, it says here, many developers and third-party libraries use the module pattern to create a single object that has private state. Single object means you won't want to have more than one. The example that they use here is they say, as an example, like this task list. There's only one task list. It could have 1,000,000 tasks, but there's only one of them. All right, and that's what they're getting to there rather. It says to do that, you can use one of these ifs to define a function expression and immediately call or invoke it. All right. And so then they come in and they talk some more about what ifs are. You already saw this. You saw examples that were very similar to the ones that you see here on the top of page 591. Again, they're not identical, but they're very similar in nature. All right. Middle of the page, it says an if helps keep variables, constants, and functions out of global scope. Just as we talked about before. All right. It tries to make sure that the scope is the way that it should be. Second, it helps prevent name conflicts. We'll see that a little bit later on in the chapter as well. And third, it can be used to create private state for an object. Again, I don't want to read these to you because it explains what an if is. We've already gone over that. All right? All right. The next thing they talk about in here, and I think I mentioned this to you yesterday, and that is working with namespaces. All right? And the idea with a namespace is if you've got two different developers working on the same project, and they happen to be working on two different parts of the project, and they happen to create a variable or a method or something that has the same name, and then they try to put their code together, there very well could be problems. All right? And believe it or not, you already know what namespaces are. If you remember, it was right near the end of the semester in the C# class when we were doing using. All right, we always put all that stuff like using system, whatever it was, system.io, etc. And there were some other ones. Then we went in and at least one time we added our own. We made our own class file and we had our own using. When we did that, we had to give it a special name. Why? Because somebody else could have used that name as well. All right? And that's what they're talking about here with namespaces. All right, it says when you work with module patterns, when you work with anything, it's common to use a namespace, which is a way to keep your objects out of the global namespace. It keeps you from having what are referred to as collisions. Again, when you have two different developers typically, or more, that name the same thing, name two different things the same thing, which would confuse you in code. All right. All right, the last part of the chapter, 2, 4, 6, the last 6 pages, because we're not going to go over the slideshow, talks about ES modules. I had that down, but I didn't. All right, and it says there, closures and module pattern provide a way to give private state. However, they are cumbersome and result in code that's difficult to understand. So, as time has gone on, the people who, the creators, the maintainers of JavaScript have tried to come up with better and better ways of doing things. This, you may or may not find this a little bit, I'm not going to say difficult, but different, because the way this is done in JavaScript is done a little bit differently than the way it's done in other languages, because they use importing and exporting, and sometimes they don't use them. Now, what does that mean? Well, just watch if you would. All right. So as it says here, ES modules allow you to import and export keywords to import and export items from a module. What does that mean? It means you create a module, which isn't exactly a function because it can contain a bunch of functions, but it's a bunch of code. And then what you can tell the system is, I want to export just pieces of it, or I want to export the whole thing. Once you do that and you import it into another file, now that file can use everything that was declared in the other file, everything that you import in. All right? And it actually does make a whole heck of a lot of sense when you start working with it. It really and truly, it's not that it's bad. All right? And good, bad, or indifferent, there's different ways at least that you can export. All right? So when you look at the example here, it says here, this is a module that exports 3 functions. Now, they're not writing it, they're just saying that it would be some stuff in there. And then they're exporting it. They're exporting the stuff out, which again is going to make it available to any other routine that imports that stuff in. All right? So it says there, they provide a way to define a module that has private state. To export a single item, you use the word exports. To export a list of items, code a single export statement followed by a list of curly braces. We're going to be using this all the time in Node after about the first week or two. Because what's going to happen is you start to write what are called routes, and that basically is when you put in a different URL, where do you want it routed to? Where do you want to go to? And it's not bad if you only have a few routes. But if you have a lot of them, then what's going to happen is your main file starts getting really, really, really big, and it gets unruly. So you typically take those routes out, and you put either each one in its own file, or you have a routing file. All right, and then you end up exporting a lot of that stuff and then importing it into your main JavaScript file. So to import items, as it says, you code an import statement at the beginning of the JavaScript file. All right, and again, we're going to be doing quite a bit of this. Now it says to be able to import or export items, you must declare the script as a module. All right. Typically, that just means that you're going to have the word module in it. That's all. All right, and you've got to give it a name. Now, as they mentioned right there, here's some stuff with a module. So this is where we're transitioning over. A module must be run from a server. If you try to run a module from the browser, you're going to get an error. All right. It uses strict mode automatically, so you don't have to say using strict. It uses the defer attribute automatically, so you don't have to add defer. It's only executed once, and as it says, it's imported into the scope of a single script. So if I need it in multiple files, I have to import it multiple times. I can't just do one global import into one file and boom, now it's available everywhere. It doesn't work like that. And they give you a couple more things working with this. So I'm on the bottom here of page 599. All right, they talk about renaming, and it's not that important a thing. Now it says to import all the items of a module in, you can use the star keyword. Jeff, you just said we can't do that. No, that's taking everything that's in one file and importing it to another file. There is no way that I know of that I can say, hey, I want to take this, now I want to import it to every file in my program. You've got to have separate import statements. And I think the reason they did that is you really should only be importing modules into a file if they're needed. If I've got a program that's got 10 different JavaScript files in it and I only need this module in 3 of them, it makes no sense to put it in all 10. Because again, typically it can result in those side effects that we talked about. All right, and I think that's just about it for the chapter. Now, before we finish up, I am going to ask that at least you try, and you'll have time today. Now, if you're still working on the project that we've been working on, fine. But this chapter, especially from all the ones we probably covered so far, it would help a lot if you would read this chapter. All right? Because the examples that we go through tomorrow may or may not make a lot of sense until you read the chapter. And a key part in here is this section. It's not very long. But what we're talking about doing now is going out to the internet typically. You don't have to do it that way. There's different ways of doing it. But typically, going out to the internet, asking for some information and bringing it back into our program. Well, eventually that information that we ask when we go out there, it'll be our own stuff that we will have saved out to the internet into a database or whatever, and then we'll be able to grab whatever it is we want. All right? So I'm not sure, I don't remember, because I have gone back and reread these, and I'm only halfway through this chapter. But I'm going to look at this photo viewer application. If it's good, we may go through it. I don't know. The other part that's in here that's important is this 10-page section on promises. All right, and I've mentioned this to you before. What we're getting into, they started here. In fact, let's see, which page did they say it starts on? It'll transition into the next chapter, but we will be talking all about asynchronous programming. We've talked a little bit about it before, but we will be talking about it in more depth and breadth of coverage. Finally, as it says there, how to make cross-origin requests, and that's as it says. It's when you end up doing stuff across domains. And again, it says how to handle that with APIs. We're going to get into that, but one of the things that we're going to be bringing in often from that npm, the node package manager.js file that I showed you yesterday, is you can bring in cores, and it'll do a lot of this work for you. So again, if you get the chance, please take some time. All right. If we do finish up, maybe it won't take that long tomorrow. I don't know. This took less time than I thought it would. But if tomorrow it takes less time, I'm going to start. I've got some examples that I've created already, and I'm going to continue on with them. And then we're going to continue with those examples on Friday. All right? Questions? All right. That's all I had.